Hello everybody, welcome to today's seminar or hybrid seminar from the Migration Policy Centre of the European University Institute. We have great pleasure today to welcome Anatina Arna, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, who is a Fernand Braudel Senior Fellow in the Department of Political and Social Sciences here at the Institute and also based at the University of Lausanne. So what Anatina is going to talk about today is a paper with three co-authors on ethnic clustering in schools and early career outcomes. So we're very happy to welcome Anatina. Looking forward to the presentation. Speak for around 30 minutes, then we'll have time for Q&A. So the people who are online, could you please put any questions you might have into the chat box on YouTube, and then you can join the discussion. So very happy to welcome Anatina, and over to you.
Many thanks, Professor Geddes, for welcoming me and our paper to the Migration Policy Centre seminar series, and thanks also to Marita for all the organizational work behind. I'm very excited, and it's a great pleasure to present our paper Ethnic Clustering in Schools and Early Career Outcomes here in the seminar series. It's work co-authored together with Caroline Juer, Beatrix Aixter, and Roland Baudouin. Before I start, I would like to say a few words about this project. So far, we have been concentrating on identifying causally the effect of ethnic clustering in schools on ethnic students' early career outcomes. However, in this presentation, I would like to put a slightly different focus. I would like to see how this effect differs across different migrant groups. And so I would first like to look at how different ethnic groups' chances to go into different career options differs depending on their migrant background, and then also how these peer effects differ. So the research question we're concerned with in this project is, how does migrant background and ethnic clustering in schools affect migrant students in their transition into post-compulsory education? I will structure my talk as follows. I will first show you that this is a relevant question and also familiarize you with the context of Switzerland and its schooling system. I will then try to frame or to somehow theorize this transition based on sociological literature on primary and secondary effects, and combine it with economic literature on peer effects. I will then introduce our empirical approach. We analyze an administrative data set covering all students at lower secondary level in Switzerland. And what we see is that these effects differ markedly across different migrant groups. On this graph, you see the absolute level of different migrant streams to Switzerland starting in 1860, going until 2020. And I would like to disentangle this graph a little bit starting in the 1960s. What you see in the 1960s is a thick dark blue bulge, and this is the Italian guest worker movement to Switzerland. After the Second World War, Switzerland had an economic boom and it needed lots of workers to somehow cover the posts open. In parallel, you see a bit of a smaller, light blue grayish bulge, the Spanish migrant workers that came at the same time. Switzerland had bilateral agreements with both countries so as to facilitate seasonal workers coming to Switzerland. You see that migration diminishes a bit around 1973 with the oil crisis. We had a recession and we didn't need any, or not so much migrant workers anymore. With the economic recovery in the 80s, migration expands again. However, this time it's from different migrant origins. So we recruited workers predominantly from Portugal as well as from ex-Yugoslavia. The migration from ex-Yugoslavia later on expanded as well due to the war and the atrocities there, but it started off as a migrant, labor migrant movement. You see then that there is a further expansion around 2004 when Switzerland joined the European Union Schengen Agreement that facilitated further the migration from Northern European countries. And you see that in light blue on top. And you see also the German migration between the Italian and the ex-Yugoslavian also expands a bit around that time. So what you see is we have a lot of migration from different origins, and it's perhaps also important to know that about 30% of the Swiss working population is from migrant origin, that you don't see in this graph. What is furthermore is that migrant populations tend to cluster in certain areas. So in this graph, you see the outline of Switzerland with its administrative units, the subfederal cantons, and you see in different shades of blue the average share of in percentages of a specific migrant population in schools. So in dark blue areas, there is more than 6% of a certain migrant background population in Swiss schools. And you see also that different groups tend to cluster in different areas. You see Albanians, Serbians, and Turkish clustering more in the north, and the Portuguese, for instance, settling more in the western part of Switzerland where they speak French, and also settling more in the mountainous areas where there's a lot of hospitality industry, which is traditionally where Portuguese workers were recruited for. So this leaves us with somehow a picture where there's a lot of migration from different origins clustered in schools. And the Swiss, what we are interested in is how do these different migrant groups join post-compulsory options, or which post-compulsory options do they rather join, and does this clustering in schools affect the path migrant youth take? In Switzerland, there are 4 options in post-compulsory education. You can either go into vocational education and training. You can join an academic track, which prepares you then for university. If you neither join the academic track nor land an apprenticeship position, you probably go into some form of transitional education for a year. And the worst outcome clearly is no post-secondary education. It is important to note that VET, vocational education and training, is a very important alternative in Switzerland. About 60% of Swiss youth join this kind of formation. It means that youth go to school 2 days and work in a business 3 days. And typical professions learned in that way may include carpenters and hairdressers, but these may also be commercial clerks. So there's a variety of professions that you access through such a VET degree. What is also important to note is that in Switzerland, there is an early tracking. So this decision in which profession you go is at the age 15 after 9 years of compulsory schooling. So it's really at an early age that kids join a different path and then are somehow kept within these vocational tracks. And before this background, we ask the questions: do migrant groups differ with respect to the post-compulsory schooling options they join? And do peer effects, that is, whether you are in class with peers of your same background, differ across different migrant groups? And in the following, I would like to somehow theorize how ethnic migrant background could affect these post-compulsory education decisions. So, starting with Boudin, Boudin suggested that there are primary and secondary effects of socioeconomic status on schooling outcomes. And he said that there is a negative primary effect of socioeconomic status on educational performance. So if you are from a family with a low socioeconomic status, you tend to have lower grades. And that is a consequence of your parents spending less time with you on homework, or you having less access to books and so forth. In addition to this lower performance, there is a negative secondary effect. That means that students from families with low socioeconomic status also tend to choose less ambitious career tracks. So in the context of Switzerland, that would mean that somebody from a family with a low socioeconomic status would go rather into VET than into the academic track, given the same grades as somebody from a middle-income family. These primary and secondary effects have been analyzed for migrant youth also across different education systems. And what this literature finds is that there is the same negative primary effect of migrant status on educational performance. So migrant students tend to perform worse, or they have lower grades in school. However, there is a positive secondary effect of migrant status on educational choices. kids with a migrant background with the same grades as those with no migrant background take more ambitious career choices. And the reasons for this positive secondary effect might be manifold. So there might be a positive selection of migrants already. So in order to go or to migrate, you need to have a lot of initiative. You're driven, you have taken, you're somehow more initiative than those that perhaps stay, and thus your kids might also have these characteristics. Then there might also be an effect of compensation for downward mobility. So we know that migrants usually experience downward mobility when they arrive in a new economy. And so the children might try to somehow compensate for that. So if you know that your, say, mother was an engineer in your country of origin, and now she's working as a cleaner, you might have an extra incentive to somehow compensate for that. And then very specific to the Swiss system, there might also be that students with a migrant background fear to be discriminated when looking for an apprenticeship position. So this is students at the age 15 apply for these apprenticeships positions, and employers are known to discriminate against migrants. And so they might already anticipate that and rather opt for the academic track. And then we know from the peer effects literature that students are social beings and that their peers affect a variety of outcomes. So for instance, we know that non-English language speaking peers affect school performance. So if you are in class with somebody that doesn't speak the language as well, the local language as well, you might also learn a bit less, or your grades might suffer because the teachers invest more resources in these students and so forth. And what is more, peers also affect aspirations. So if you're in class with a lot of students that have high aspirations and that aim to go into the academic track, that you might be motivated to do so as well. So from the peer effects literature, we might assume that peers reinforce both a negative primary effect of migrant students, so that the grades might be lowered. However, they might also reinforce positive or more ambitious aspirations. So this is what we assume here. For migrants with a low socioeconomic status, a negative primary effect outweighs a positive secondary effect, so the effect of migrant background on post-compulsory education. And then for the effect of ethnic clustering or peer effect on post-compulsory education of migrant students, we would assume that for migrants with a low socioeconomic status, a positive secondary peer effect outweighs a negative primary effect. The data we look at is all 8th graders from 2011 to 2016 in Switzerland, for which we observe at least 1 year of post-compulsory education. We have a sample of around 400,000 students in 1 year, so these are 5 cohorts, there are about 80,000 students. The data is called LAB, Längsschnittanalyse im Bildungsbereich. These are longitudinal educational data. It's basically administrative data from school registers, and we know individual characteristics such as age, gender, nationality, language, but we do not know, for instance, test scores, so we cannot look at performance of students. We also know which school they went to in grade 8, so we know their school, we know the track, and we know the class, and we know which option they chose at the post-secondary level, so at the post-compulsory level. Whether they went to academic track, BET, transition education, or no post-compulsory education. Here I show you schematically the Swiss education system and also how we identify peers for our analysis. So the Swiss education system is characterized by 2 years of kindergarten, followed by 6 years of primary school and 3 years of lower secondary school. And then this is the compulsory schooling, and then post-compulsory schooling starts. And for peers, we look at grade 8, marked in red here. And in lower secondary school, you see that there's a lower track and a higher track. So students are separated into different tracks based on performance. And we assume that your peers are those students that are in the same track in the same school. So if you're in the lower track, then all the students in the lower track in the same school are your peers. We do not look at classes because we think that classes might be not randomly composed. So school principals might leave best friends together from primary school or not. So we think the tracks are better for random variation. And then we look at how the presence of ethnic peers affects your chance to transition into no post-compulsory education, a bridge year, a VET program, or an academic education. And because we want to understand how these effects differ across different groups, we here differentiate the different groups of migrants. We base this distinction on hypothesized socioeconomic status and follow categorizations already proposed for the Swiss context by other authors. In group 1, we have the Northern European migrants, German, French, English, Greek, Dutch, Swedish, Danish, Norwegian, and Finnish. And in the second group, we have those that came in the 90s, 80s as labor work, like for labor movement. And these are the Portuguese, the Serbian, the Albanian, the Croatian, and the Turkish. And then group 3, those were also guest workers, Italian and Spanish, but they have come in the 60s and have assimilated rather well and have, compared to the Swiss population, about the same socioeconomic status. Group 1 has a higher socioeconomic status than the Swiss, and group 2 has still a comparatively lower socioeconomic status, even though they have had some upward mobility. And here I'd like to plausibilize this distinction. I do not have data on the socioeconomic status, but we know whether they are naturalized or not, so the students that we have in our sample, and whether or not they were born in Switzerland. And what we see, there is marked differences between these groups. So in group 1, a lot of the students have a Swiss passport and also have been born in Switzerland. Group 2 has the lowest share of naturalization and also the lowest share of students born in Switzerland. And group 3 is in the middle, basically. And here, we haven't yet done the analysis where we look at how these ethnic background groups affect the chance to go into different options. But for this presentation, I just put the share that we have in our sample that goes into academic track, VET track, transitional education, no post-secondary education by these groups. And what we see is that the group 1, about 46% goes into the academic track, 28% into the VET track, and about 16% in transitional education. Perhaps as a reference, in the Swiss population, about 20%, 25 go into academic track, about 60 go into VET track, and about 10 go in transitional education. I haven't put that on the slide. This differs quite a bit from group 2. These are the Serbians, Albanians, Turkish, Croatians, and the Portuguese. They have a diminished chance to go, or they're less likely to go into the academic track with 14%. They're more likely to go into VET with 49%. They are more likely to go into transition education with about 27%, and about the same go into no post-secondary education. And a similar pattern prevails for group 3, which is the Italians and the Spanish. So about 23% go into the academic track, 44% into VET, 24% into transitional education, and 10% in no post-secondary education. And now that we know somehow, like, what is the pattern for the different migrant groups, we look at how the presence of peers that are from the same nationality or the same group affect these students' transition into these groups. What we estimate here is the binary outcome for student I in school track S and year T to go into either academic track, vocational track, transitional track, or no post-secondary education. And we are interested in the share of foreign language speakers, SFL, and the share of same foreign language speakers, SSFL. And then we control for a set of individual characteristics, namely own gender, age, and dummies for the student's first language. We also control for a set of school track cohort characteristics, namely the leave one out average age of the peers, the share of female peers, and the size of school track cohort. We have a interacted school track fixed effects. These are basically taking up anything that varies between these school tracks. Say, for instance, if you have very good teachers in one school track and they facilitate access to academic education a lot, then we take that out. And cohort fixed effects, which control for time trends. Say, for instance, if 1 year has COVID and nobody goes into VET, then we take that out. What we do is we exploit the random variation in ethnic composition of cohorts within school tracks, as I already mentioned, not classes, because we think it's more randomized in the school tracks rather than the classes. And we estimate separate linear regression for each outcome. We cluster standard errors at the school track cohort level to account for correlation across subjects within common environments. And here you see the results for this regression. So we have the share of foreign language and the share of same foreign language and how it affects each of these 4 outcomes. And what you see immediately, if you average or if you don't differentiate the groups that I just presented, that having more foreign language speakers in your cohort and having more of the same foreign language speakers in your cohort decreases your chance to go into the academic track. And now it's interesting to see where do students go, because you have to choose one of the 4, so it has to somehow add up. So for the share of foreign language speakers, you see that if you have more foreign language speakers in your cohort, then you have an increased likelihood to go into VET. That's what this arrow means. So the decreased chance to go into the academic track comes at the expense basically of an increased chance to go into VET. This pattern differs for the share of same foreign language speakers. So there, the decrease in chance to go into the academic track is compensated for by an increased chance to go into no post-secondary education, which is quite worrying if you think about it. And also, like this, there's an increased chance to go into a transitional education for the share if you have an increase of the share of same foreign language speakers. Now we differentiate this picture and we see a puzzling diversity of, we see a puzzling effect that differs a lot for certain groups. So here I've put on the effects, the same effects for the second group, which is the Albanian, Portuguese, Serbian, Croatian, and Turkish. And below you have the share of foreign language speakers, the share of same foreign language speakers averaged for all the groups, and then the share of same foreign language speakers just for this group. And you see that for this particular group, having more of peers of the same group actually increases your chance to go into the academic track. And this contrasts if you have the average effect that actually diminishes your chance to go into the academic track. And the increased chance to go into the academic track is compensated for by a decreased chance to go into no post-secondary education. This is particularly remarkable, as you see in the last panel. And for if you average across groups, you see that if you have more peers with foreign language speakers, it decreases your chance to go into the academic track, and it increases your chance to go into no post-secondary education. And here I've put on basically all the groups differentiated. So you see the share of foreign language speakers, share of same foreign language speakers with the first group, how it affects your chances to go into the academic group. The first group were the Northern Europeans. Then the second group are the Serbs, Croatians, Albanians, Turkish, and Portuguese. And the third group are the Italians and the Spanish. And you see that the share or being in a cohort with more Albanians and being Albanians increases your chance to go into the academic track, but this is not the case, say, for instance, for Germans or for Italians. And this effect of going to academic track or not going into the academic track is mostly compensated for by the no post-secondary education that increases for the first group, say for the Germans, and the third group, the Italians and Spanish. So where does this leave us? So what we see is that those groups that have a higher chance to go into academic track, say that the Northern Europeans, they do not benefit at all by being in the same class with students from their same ethnic backgrounds. However, migrants that have a lower chance to go into academic track, such as Albanians, Serbians, Turks, they benefit a lot from peers that are in the same cohort. So what this leads me to hypothesize is that primary and secondary peer effects go into the opposite direction of the primary and secondary effects. So it would mean that migrant groups with a low socioeconomic status and a low probability to go, for instance, into the academic track seem to benefit more from peers of the same language group. And for migrant groups with high socioeconomic status, same language peers are somehow detrimental if you follow the idea that it's academic training is better than vocational training is better than no post-secondary education. The limitations are that we cannot really distinguish between primary and secondary peer effects because we do not have data on individual achievement. And what I would like to discuss, or perhaps is if this idea is further exploring, I don't really know, to check directly for parents' socioeconomic status. We have data on that. Then I think it would be interesting to distinguish boys and girls in the analysis, because I assume that this choice of further education and so on is really also dependent on gender. And then perhaps also conduct some interviews with some Portuguese and Serbian migrant students to better understand their reasoning behind their positive secondary effects. I thank you a lot for your attention, and I look forward very much to your feedback and your comments. Many thanks.
Thanks very much, Anatina. So yeah, there's a lot there, and we've got time now for questions, comments. Well, maybe start in the room if anybody has any questions, although we do also have questions online. So maybe, well, given that we have a question online, perhaps we can gather our thoughts and we can put that question to you. It's come from Kerry Harmon. So Kerry asks whether schools face pressure to push a certain percentage of their students into the academic track, is one question that Kerry Hartman has asked. And the second question is, how was SSFL calculated for Germans? Don't they speak the language of instruction natively in many cases? So those are two questions from Kerry Harmon. Thank you, Kerry. If anybody else has any questions they'd like to put online, feel free to do so.
Sure. Many thanks. So, two excellent questions. So I don't think that their schools are face any pressure to push a certain percentage of students into an academic track. On the contrary, I think schools really try to, like in Switzerland, there's this notion that VET is really very valuable, and so like that's the favorite option for students to go. So I think there's this like 20% that goes into academic track. I don't think that there's somehow a pressure to push there. And you point out a difficulty that we had, in fact, in estimating this SSFL and SFL, and that is that even like Germans might speak the local language. And so, in fact, Germans that are in the German-speaking area that are not captured in our analysis. And in the same vein, Italian-speaking, like Swiss that are living in a different area are actually captured by our measure. And that is certainly a shortcoming, but we haven't found really a good way to address this. So if you have an idea, then great.
Great, thanks. And thanks for the questions. We have Lenka Drajanov in the room, wants to ask a question. We also have a question online as well. So we'll take those first.
Thank you, Andrew. So first of all, it was a fascinating study. So it was very nice listening to you. I have, well, first I have a maybe clarification question, because it wasn't clear to me whether the socioeconomic status, it is my understanding that you somehow attributed that to the different groups. And for me, if that's the case, it's slightly problematic, I would say. And then, for instance, if you have data on the parents' socioeconomic status, I would absolutely push you towards this direction, to use that to the actual socioeconomic, because it seems quite arbitrary to attribute to someone based on an ethnic background just a socioeconomic status. So that would...
Could you ask you to stop sharing your screen as well, then we can see who's speaking? Sorry, Lenka.
No problem. So this is my clarification question. Then and this maybe goes a little bit towards the direction of the previous question. I would be also interested in seeing an analysis for Swiss people in the same school or class, and whether there is some effect there. Maybe it's the same So there might be some school effects or class effects particularly. And finally, and this I do understand this is a standard economics approach, cluster standard errors and so on and so forth. Because I come from political science, so we really like multi-level modeling. So I would be kind of suggesting at least as kind of a robustness check, because also what multi-level could tell you is actually the variation in classes and schools of the outcomes. And you could actually not just claim that you think there is no classes are random, but you could actually empirically check that. So that would be my suggestion. Thank you.
Thanks, Lenka. So do you want to respond to those? And we have 2 more questions online. So, oh, okay. So yeah, we can gather questions. No, we can gather questions. That's fine, because we have a question from Marlos Haganaz online, who thanks you for your presentation, Anatina. And she asks, what potentially causes ethnic clustering? Is there a role of teacher attitudes? And then Laura Cassio asks whether it was possible for you to compare data with PISA insights into aspirations and growth and mindset. That's a question from Laura Cassio. So that's an update. Do you want to respond to those? I think that's enough to be.
So many thanks. I'm with you. Highly problematic distinction. I would really like that's the next step we need to take. It's not as fallen from the sky as it looks, perhaps, because there's others that have used this classification and found, or for instance, analyzed primary and secondary effect and distinguished these groups. And it's also based on the arrival. So that I first labeled them generations. So like the first generation that came is basically the Italians and Spanish, then and so forth. But I'm really with you with having to check more whether this also matches with socioeconomic status. And then the multi-level modeling. I have to admit, I am not the one doing the models in this paper, but I see your point that it would be interesting to look at multi-level models to also find out what type of what share of variation is absorbed basically by classes and so forth. But I understand that we run some tests that assure that the variation we actually exploit is random. So these tests are called bifurcal and stuff. I'm not doing those, but I trust my co-authors that they did a thorough job doing that. But I'll bring that up and see what they say. And then what causes ethnic clustering? I think one thing that causes ethnic clustering is basically that they settle in different areas. So as we saw initially, that certain groups really tend to move more to certain areas. The second thing is you saw that there's lower tracks and higher tracks in Switzerland, and lots of migrants join the lower track and not the higher track. And I think that's another aspect that causes ethnic clustering. And then it would be highly interesting to compare or link our data with PISA. And I know of one scholar that has done that, but I'm not sure whether we have access to PISA as well and to link the data. We have linked it also to labor market data, and that was already a bit of a tricky business to get that done. But I think it would be highly valuable if we could do that for sure. Right.
Another question as well, which is, Kerry Harmon is following up because, well, it's a comment, I think, the first point. What Kerry says is she doubts that children in the years 2011 to 2016 who speak Italian and Spanish are the children of 1960s guest workers. Wouldn't they be children of more recent adult arrivals from these countries? And Kerry also says we're no longer getting audio online, so I'm not sure she even heard that. So maybe Kerry, if you could tell us if you're still having this problem with the audio online, that would be appreciated. Thank you. But anyway, we've got the question and those from Nikolai.
Many thanks for the great comments. So, okay, now my mic works good. So no, it's true, like how to distinguish primary and secondary effects if you don't have performance data. So what I find puzzling and why I came up with this primary and secondary effect is that one, it differs between different groups. So some groups benefit from the presence of peers and some not. So I somehow tried to explain this with some having more of a secondary effect and some not. And then it also goes against, or it is in the other direction than the effect of migrant background on transition. And so I find this hard to explain, and for me it made somehow sense to attribute it to primary and secondary effects, because in that way you can somehow explain why it goes into one direction and for some groups and the other direction for other groups. But it's true, we don't observe performance, and that is a problem. I agree with you. It would be interesting to look at who is in the lower and in the upper track, basically at the lower secondary level, and also like the linguistic proximity of certain groups in certain cantons would be interesting to analyze. I didn't get your last question about the Spanish people. So, but I
was just wondering whether you. I guess I was wondering whether you see whether how you can tell what their main language is. So if I was just saying, if your parents are Spanish and you're born in Switzerland, you might not speak Spanish. You might just speak German or French or whatever.
Yeah,
I was just wondering whether basically how you what kind of information you have on the language that they speak.
So basically, our share of foreign language is a measure of whether you speak the local language at home or whether you speak another language at home and what other language you speak at home. I didn't explain this well enough, apparently. So that's I think we don't have in our sample, or like we do not count as Spanish if you speak German at home. And that I think speaks also a bit to the question raised by Kerry. There is more recent migration from Italy, and the Italian, those originally coming in the 60s, they might not speak Italian anymore at home and therefore not be in our sample. And that's certainly true. Like if you look at the migration streams in the first slide, then you see that there's also, for instance, with the German migration and so forth, there's a lot of also in the, it's here you see also.
We're sharing that. Oh yeah, sure.
I am sharing. Wait. Okay, great. So basically, for instance, Italy continues to have send a lot of migration, and these might be also, say, for instance, high socioeconomic status people working in Swiss banks or insurance or what do I know. And I think that's also speaking a bit to a concern raised earlier, that I attribute socioeconomic status based on nationality, and that is certainly a crude measure. I agree. So.
James?
So just a really minor point following up on Nikolai's question and the question online about language. If those two things are the case, as you say they are, that would mean that the real effects of the mechanism you're trying to show would actually be larger though, right? So, which is in some way good for your paper, if we're looking for large effects, because that means they're being diluted by these alternative things going on, these German-speaking kids of Spanish bankers or whatever.
That's nice to hear.
Could I say, oh, sorry, Mara, you go first.
Just a minor point is more like a clarification. So I was wondering if you can elaborate a bit more on why did you rule out the inclusion of classes and you focus on tracks? So you talked about the the problem of randomization, if I understood correctly. But I was wondering whether, because I think that being like in the same class might play a role. Like it might affect your results. So I was still wondering whether your data like allow to control for instance, being in the same class, but through the inclusion of fixed effects, for instance, whether if it's possible, and whether the inclusion of such fixed effect of this dummies like could potentially affect your results. I think that could be.
Could I ask a question as well, Anna? It's more a clarification, because you said at the start Switzerland is a multicultural country. And I suppose I was thinking about multiculturalism with a small m, that there are many groups of migrant origin, and multicultural with a capital N, where there are active policies targeted at particular groups. And I wondered if, which may lead to the question of kind of policy effects, whether there are any particular initiatives or instances or policy programs which are targeted at particular groups, maybe because of the historical situation of those groups or their experience of discrimination. And I don't know to what extent you have multiculturalism with a capital M in Switzerland, and whether there may be policy effects which you could perhaps measure at a group level.
Many thanks. I don't think we have fixed effects in there for class, and I'm not sure how it would interact with all the other fixed effects, or whether we can include this or not, but I keep it in mind and bring it up with my co-authors. Thank you for the mark. I think, what would you expect, that people interact more within their class and within their cohort, and that therefore the cohort might not be relevant to look at, or? Yeah.
So I think, I don't know, it's an empirical question, so I would try to include these dummies and see how the results are affected.
Okay.
If it's possible, of course.
Thank you. And as far as I know, thank you for the question. As far as I know, we do not have any policies aimed at non-discrimination for groups, or that would encourage or support specific groups. Actually, there's this, I'm sure you're aware of this policy database, migration policy database, and Switzerland has none of these policies that facilitate access for certain groups, and we score very low on that level. And what is more, for instance, we have one of the strictest regimes facilitating naturalization, so it's like you have to be in Switzerland for 10 years. So it's a rather, we don't have positive action for certain groups at all, and not in school, but also not in other fields, not in the labor market either.
And there's no variation within the federal system. Is that a constitutional kind of provision?
I would imagine that there are certain cantons that might have policies. So I know, for instance, the canton of Vaud, they have policies, or they have an office against discrimination, but that's really at the cantonal level, and at the national level, none.
Well, thanks. So I think everybody in the room. Oh, sorry, we have a sorry. No, sorry. Yeah, please. Can you switch the microphone on?
I had two questions. One is, and correct me if I'm wrong, but if the group with the highest socioeconomic status beforehand sort of saw no positive effect of peer effects, where co-ethnics in their school, and the lower socioeconomic groups saw a positive effect, maybe there's some seeding effects at play. So for the higher socioeconomic groups, there's just not that much room to grow, and for the lower socioeconomic groups, there's more or less only one way that you can go up over time. And the second is, and I'm not sure what the composition of the schools that you looked at looked like. Did you just focus at the ethnic group that's sort of most concentrated in one group, or did you have shares per school? Because I'm also wondering if there's not a part of the effect's not coming from maybe experiencing less discrimination, if there are sort of ethnic hierarchies in Switzerland, that the groups that are closest to native Swiss, if they're sort of concentrated in the same area, don't, or if the groups that are sort of most distant from native Swiss, if they're concentrated in the same schools with your native Swiss peers, experience less discrimination and then perform better academically?
Many thanks. Yeah, that might be that, say, for instance, if you're German and you have already a high likelihood to go into academic track, your peers being German might not push you much further. That would be interesting to look at. And then the composition of schools, what we looked at, or the share of foreign language speakers that we calculated is in the school, in the track. So that's the share we look at. And I didn't get your last question on closest to Swiss, or like those schools that are like, we look at all the schools in Switzerland. Yeah.
No, I'm just wondering if you're ethnically very different from native Swiss people, that in areas where there's just a lot of co-ethnics, you experience less discrimination based off your perceived ethnic distance, and then perform better academically because of that.
So it would be more of a fixed effect of the locality, is that?
No, it would be a function of just receiving less discrimination.
Yeah, but I mean, we control basically for school track cohorts, and I think if it was basically just something because of this area having more migration and less discrimination, then that would be picked up by this term. Yeah. Yeah, okay.
So just one thing on the terminology around the data. So it's 4,500 students, right? So you were referring to this as a sample and used confidence intervals and things, but is it actually a sample, or is this actually the population that you're looking at?
So these are 5 cohorts of Swiss population, like Swiss students. So in one cohort, there's about 80,000 students in Switzerland. Is that what was your question? It's everyone. It's everyone. It's everyone. It's everyone.
So yeah, I wouldn't use like talk about samples and stuff, and then I wouldn't also use confidence intervals either, because that's the actual effect. And then never mind, actually, that's it. I was going to make my own mistake. Yeah.
Okay, many thanks.
Well, I think we've had a great presentation, and everybody in the room has asked questions which I hope have been useful for you, Anatina. It's fascinating work, and also many thanks to the people online who've engaged with this research. Anatina is here as Fernand Braudel Fellow this year, so there may be other opportunities to hear her speak here at EUI and also follow her work. So it's really interesting stuff. We're very grateful to you to present to us this afternoon. Many thanks.
Many thanks to all of you for your comments and for having me in your seminar. It's been a great pleasure. And many thanks for all your comments.
Thank you.